To return to the conversation around schooling and our children now, the fact most of them going to school only every second day or every second week of schools went back to school today. Professor Haroon Saloojee is an executive member of the Paediatric Association of South Africa. Dr. Saloojee, good afternoon to you. The big question really is, should children be going back to school full time for face-to-face teaching? Do you believe it's safe for them to do that?
So, Stephen, that's a difficult question, but my immediate response is yes. And let me explain it. So, you know that pediatricians, our association, for the last year has been encouraging children to go to school. But there were 3 points we insisted on. First, there needed to be physical distancing. Children had to be 1 meter away apart from each other. They had to wear masks, and they had to be good hygiene. And so the question now is, why aren't all children going to class? And the answer is simple, because many of the classrooms can't accommodate all the children safely because there just wasn't enough distance. So has anything changed? And the answer is yes and no. So in fact, there was a study done about 3 weeks ago in the United States, or released 3 weeks ago in the United States, where schools in Massachusetts, about 500,000 children at 250 schools with about 100,000 teachers, they compared what the COVID infection rates were between children who were 1 meter apart and in schools where children were 2 meters apart. And interestingly, they found no difference. Now, in South Africa, we've been following the 1 meter rule, which is what the WHO suggested since schools opening. So does that mean anything to us? And I think the principle here is that if 1 meter is as safe as 2 meters, is half a meter or quarter meter equally safe? And the simple answer is we don't know. But I think the principle is that we know that, and this was all in a situation where these children in America were wearing masks. So there's a strong possibility that if children were to continue wearing masks, that in fact a shorter distance, half a meter for example, might be safe. But we don't have the evidence scientifically yet. But I certainly believe in the end, it's an issue of risk against benefit. We've had this discussion before. A lot of COVID is risk and benefit. And I believe that we all know the risk. We've heard from the educationalists that the benefits probably exceed the risk. And yes, children should be going to school.
It's interesting because you're giving me a much more nuanced answer. I mean, I remember very clearly when you and I spoke a year ago, we've spoken at least twice in the last year about this. You were adamant that children should go back to school, but it shows you really how important social distancing is, I suppose, when you give a nuanced answer like that. Now, I'm going to ask a complicated question. It was complicated for me because I'm not a doctor. But there's been a lot of research into COVID-19 and its impact, more research on any other disease in as short a time than anything we've ever seen before. And I remember you telling us how the risk of children developing severe symptoms was incredibly low. Now, that was the first time you told us that was a year ago. I imagine there's been a lot more research since then. Is the new research since then still coming to the same outcome, that children are at a very low risk of developing severe symptoms of COVID-19?
So, Stephen, the evidence hasn't changed. So it's exactly the same. We still know that children, much fewer children get the disease. If they get the disease, they're much less likely to be ill, and very, very few children die. So that evidence hasn't changed, and still that's true. In a school setting, what's important is we've recognized that younger children from about 2 to 10 years, are at much lower risk of both acquiring the disease and getting ill than high school children. So I think that's important in this discussion as well. But that hasn't changed. And so when you're asking me whether my answer is nuanced, in fact, it's partially nuanced, because we've always said children must go back to school, but we recognize that social distancing or physical distancing are important. The education department for a long time has been asking us as medical experts, can we get all children to school? Is it safe? And as I said, the only reason my response is nuanced is I don't have the scientific evidence. But certainly we've got some evidence now, new evidence, that you don't have to be as far apart as 2 meters. And I'm arguing that maybe even half a meter or perhaps less, if you wear a mask, may be safe. So I'm trying to be scientific in my response. But I certainly personally do believe that children should be going to schools, particularly primary school children, the younger children. But even I would argue high school children in a setting. The situation I would be a little bit uncomfortable is where you know there's gross overcrowding. And I presume there are still some schools that have gross overcrowding. The calculation I've done suggests that a child, to be safe, for 1 meter needs about 3 meters of space around him. And in an average classroom of about 60 meters squared, you could fit in 20 children comfortably. If you reduce that size, and clearly if you had excessive overcrowding. But the point you make, and so let me finish this, is saying that even if we did the worst scenario, the children were squeezed into classrooms, they may not have masks. The danger of children getting the infection remains low. I mean, we don't have great science for that. We don't have schools where children have been allowed to have no masking. The infection rate's low, and their transmission rates to their teachers, to their grandparents at home, is probably about half of what adult transmission is.
So I'm going to say this very controversially. My Twitter timeline's about to explode, but the worst case scenario in all of this actually isn't that bad. I realize, though, let me just say very carefully, that for someone who does contract the disease, it can be very serious. But generally speaking, we're still looking at quite a low risk.
And I think that's exactly the point. Certainly the risk for children. I think the argument for a long time has been, but is that true for teachers in schools? And I think that's where teacher unions have been saying, maybe it's safe for children, but what about adults? And there again, the evidence is again increasing, that generally in South Africa, some evidence, but globally, if you look at the risk of teachers acquiring COVID, they're certainly not any higher than what's in the community. And so teachers are not a high-risk group because they're going to school. So yes, teachers can get infected. I think the fundamental argument is, even in the worst scenario, the risk for children is small. The risk of missing education is enormous. And so for me, it's a no-brainer which one wins. Risk, benefit, the benefits of all children going to school certainly outweigh the risk.
In the middle of all of this is a conversation around vaccinations, right? Now, vaccinations at the moment, the priority groups, because they're at a greater risk of developing severe symptoms, from May the 17th, the second phase of the vaccine rollout, we will start to see people over the age, I think it is, of 60 being vaccinated. People are registering now. It seems for the moment children are not going to be vaccinated. Do you think that the vaccines that we have at the moment, the Johnson & Johnson, the Pfizer vaccines that are going to be used here, would you recommend that children start to get vaccinated? I mean, probably only next year because they're at a low risk.
So there's two main responses on that question, Stephen. The first is that we know that the vaccines initially were not tested in children. They were only tested in children over the age of 16 or 18, depending on the vaccine. But in the last 3 months, these vaccines have now, in a process of de-escalation, have been used in children initially from 12 to 15 and now even 9 to 12. So the manufacturers are now testing these vaccines in children, and importantly, they've been found to be safe. So we have increasing data that the vaccines can be used in children. The second question is, are children a priority? And I think that answer we've answered before, that if adults are dying or getting infected, serious infections, they clearly are at higher risk, and so they should be prioritized. Eventually, the vaccines will have to come to children if we believe that herd immunity or community immunity is important, and the figure in South Africa, as you've heard, is 67%. We're not going to get to that target without children. So in summary, I think children, the vaccine hasn't been tested in younger children, but eventually children should be vaccinated, but they don't remain a priority group simply because the disease isn't as severe as in adults.
Professor Haroon Saloojee, thanks very much indeed, Executive Member of the Paediatric Association of South Africa. It's a complicated